Have you wondered what financial advisors actually think about finances? This is your sneak peek at the conversations within Financial Design Studio. Michelle Smollenberger, the CEO here, will be your host as you go behind the designs. Hello, and welcome back to Behind the Designs. Like we say in the intro, our whole goal with this podcast is to share the types of conversations we have with our clients. We want to put them out into the world, that way you guys can hear them and be better equipped to make decisions for your own finances. These conversations that we have always start with questions. People have 1,000 financial questions that they bring to us. And in this episode, we're breaking down an issue that we see so often as financial advisors. So I just want to welcome Michelle back. Thanks for being on the podcast again, Michelle.
Yes, happy to be here and happy to talk about this subject. I think this will be really helpful for people.
So when you think of somebody who's coming in for the first time to talk about their finances, what do you always hear?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things that people are wanting when they work with an advisor is they have questions and they need answers. They want answers. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of those questions revolve around, can my money last? Can I retire when I want to retire? Can I spend this amount? And so there's a lot of questions that revolve around that. There's also a lot of factors that go into giving that answer. So, sometimes even someone might say, well, I have this amount of money and I'm going to live until this age, let's say, and I'm going to work until this age. But even outside of that, like those factors are not enough to be able to tell you yes or no. There's a lot more pieces in that. And one of the biggest things, which we're going to talk about, is, how much money are you going to spend? I don't know. I don't know how much you need. And so that's one of the biggest factors, but it's also one of the biggest things that people don't really know. So it's very surprising, but if this is you and you're in that camp, know that you're not alone, but we can figure that out actually, very simply. So that's what we're going to talk through today. And it's important because at different stages, this amount can change. And it's important because this is how you'll know, can your money last?
Yeah. Just hearing the conversations that happen among the team after these meetings, I'm always surprised to hear how many people don't know where their money goes. I'm the type of person who is super concerned about, will I have enough? Where's it going? What did I make this month? And I track, where's my money going? When is it leaving? And so why do you think people don't track where their money's going? Why don't they know?
Yeah, well, I think, it used to be that the way that people would track information was very pencil and paper. When I think of learning how to balance a checkbook, a lot of us learned with a register, with pencil and paper, actually adding and subtracting that. But now with bank accounts where information is visible any point of the day, whatever you're spending on, it can be pretty quickly updated. I think that people know that they can go log into their bank account and they can see their balance very quickly. And for most people, that's really the only thing that they're concerned with is, do I have money there to buy this or to pay for this? And so I think because it's so quick to find out that information, we don't have to do a lot of this, pencil and paper work where we're figuring out, do I have the money before I buy it? Also use of credit card, things like this. So there's a lot of different things I think that lead up to it. But at the same time, it also comes back to, we know that we have money that we can spend, but are we also doing the other things that we need to? Because at some point, unless you plan to work your entire life, your income is going to change. And so your income may not be as high as it is now in the future. And so you've got to plan ahead for that. I was really curious, some of these statistics that we looked up, or just how many people, actually have a monthly budget, things like this. So a couple of these, 84% of Americans with a monthly budget say they've sometimes exceeded their budget, which there's always going to be times like that, right? So this is why we have things like emergency funds, right? But, so most of us would say at some point we go over. 23% of Americans say they feel like they need a budget to get by every month. What's interesting is most people say that they've sometimes exceeded their budget. A very small percentage, like a quarter of Americans, say they even need a budget to get by every month. So this is what's telling you, most people know if they can, as long as they can go log in and see what their balance is, they know that they're going to be fine. If there's money there, I can pay for this. I don't need to think ahead necessarily, because really budgeting, a spending plan, whatever you want to call it, so that it doesn't sound scary or mean. That's all it is kind of planning ahead and saying, where do I want my money to go? So I think it's interesting, just kind of some of these statistics when we think about this.
No, that's so true. And I think you brought up an interesting point about people don't need to know where their money's going as long as their balance is positive in their bank account. As long as they have that green number, who cares where it's actually going? But interestingly enough, knowing where your money goes is one of the most important things you need to know to make a financial plan, to, set out to achieve your goals. But that's not the only reason understanding where your money goes is important. So what are some other reasons?
Well, that's what I was going to say. You could very well get by living kind of with that plan of, as long as there's money in my bank account, I'm fine. That would work for you as long as outside of that, you are taking out savings that's saving for the future. You're taking out a lot of things so that the only thing that is left in there is what can actually be spent. So if everything else is being set aside out of that, then you could just adopt that, because that is spending only money. So this is where this kind of gets tricky, is because everybody's different. Everybody uses different systems and they need different processes. And at the core of this, though, even someone who says, okay, yes, I'm saving, so the rest of my paycheck's getting put into my checking account and all of those things are getting done, you still had to be thoughtful of how much should you be saving, how much needs to be set outside of this. So you can see that someone who wants to know if their money's going to last, someone that wants to know they're going to have money when they need it in the future, when they decide to stop working, you can see that this is where this planning becomes important, because you have to have thought ahead of this, unless you're just going to follow some standard percentages. But this is where kind of this thought comes in. So someone can live that way as long as they're actually saving outside of that. So for example, from your paycheck, you say, I'm saving X percent into my 401k. I'm saving, or I'm setting aside this much to be given, or I'm setting aside this much for these other things. So whatever is left that goes in your bank account can be spent. You could function that way. What's interesting, though, is the person who's doing that, you'll see there's already forethought. They had to think about, well, what's the amount that I'm saving? What's the amount that I'm setting outside of that, so that this is what's left? So anyone who's actually deciding, this is how much I have to spend because I'm doing these other things, they are doing planning. They are doing some level of setting a budget or setting an amount of these things and where they're going. So however you choose to do it, that's why as advisors, we can tell you there's a lot of different systems that you can use, but it's very personal. It's what applies to you and what you want to use. So you can use any of these ways, but at the core of it, you have to know how much you're spending in different categories. And if you are spending money anywhere besides just cash, so if you buy things and if you buy 100% of your things in your life with cash, for you, it's actually going to be hard to figure out how much you're spending in each item. However, if you don't, and most people don't, so I would say most people can track what they're spending. It's just a matter of, where am I spending? So is that credit card? Is it bank? So we're going to go through that today. We're going to actually help people, because it's so important when we're trying to answer that question of, will your money last? It's important because not only today, let's say you're, a young working, starting your career, or a family, or someone who's nearing retirement, all of these different life stages or places in life, your income is going to be changing. So whether your income's increasing or whether your income's going to be decreasing because you're retiring, you've got to know what you're spending so that you know where money needs to come from. So that's why this is so important. And we have to know this. And so, a lot of people will come to us and they don't know what they're spending. And that's okay. We always say we're not judging you for everything, that's happened in the past and things like that. It's going forward. It's how are we helping you to track this stuff or to get to these numbers. And so we have ways that we back into them if you don't know. So we're going to talk through some of those today, just an easy way to find that information. But also if you want more of the details, we're going to talk about how you can find this and how you can get to these amounts so that you can, be better prepared when you're trying to plan ahead.
Yeah. So to answer the questions that you will have, such as, do I have enough money? Can I retire? Can I afford my kids' college? You have to know where your money goes. And that's everything that's coming in and that's everything that's coming out, AKA a cash flow. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about why understanding a cash flow can be super helpful.
Yeah, so the why of this is really important because at some point in the future, if you ever plan to retire, so if you don't plan to work your entire life, your income is going to change. And so if today all of your expenses are met by your income coming in and you stop working in the future, that income decreases to whatever that is, even if it's Social Security or if it's from savings, you have to know what you're spending to know if that income later, when it changes, is going to cover those expenses. So it's really important to start to think about it. Now, it doesn't mean that you're going to know before you retire everything that you're spending on and when that's going to happen. You can figure some of these things out, but we can also start to set some amounts. Well, let's say that I'm going to travel or I'm going to need to buy a car once every 10 years, things like that. We can build in some estimation. So there are things we can build in. You don't have to know it down to the penny, but you've got to have some idea of this is the lifestyle we live. And a lot of people, it's very surprising to say, we live very simply. We live really frugally. Whatever that is for you, it's okay. We just need to make sure that what you're saving and what you're earning is going to cover that. So whatever that is for you, that's why it's important, because you need to know if you can always live that way. And we assume that most people want to be able to continue living the lifestyle that they're living today. Not many people say, when I retire, I'm actually going to start living a completely different way, whether that's spending a lot more or drastically spending a lot less. And so we always assume very basically that people want to continue living how they are.
Understanding cash flow is also super impactful for relationships. So how have you seen helping people understand where their money goes impact the different family dynamics?
Well, it's interesting because, in a relationship, you have two people and we were all raised how to think about money, how to handle money, spend, earn, all of those pieces differently. And so we all come into relationships thinking about money one way than the other. And so there's also different situations. So one spouse might make more than the other. One spouse might stay at home. There's different pieces to this where isn't normal, or it isn't necessarily common that both people are working, they're earning the exact same amount, and they're splitting up the expenses equally, 50-50 from each income. You have different situations. And so you have to talk through these things. You have to be able to function, because cash flow and life you have to be flexible. It's kind of fluid. Things are going to happen. Things are going to come up. Things are going to change. Expenses are going to come. You might get a bonus. It's, on both sides. And so you have to be able to talk about these things, to function within them, but to make changes as you go too. And so this is where at the core of it, if you say, well, long term, like these are our goals and these are the things that we know we need to do. Outside of that, if you're earning more, if you don't have an expense or you have an expense come up, then you can figure these things out. But if you don't even figure these basic things out of here's where our money goes normally, then you don't even really have a starting place. So you have to go through these basics to get to a point of here's what we normally do. So then when something different happens, what are we going to do?
Yeah. And I think it also gives people an opportunity to have a common ground,
Yeah.
We always say here, like, the numbers don't lie. And so if you have that basic foundation, you can understand where you need to go based on where you're starting from.
You're exactly right. One of the common things, right? People say, show me your checkbook, your calendar, things like that, and we can tell you what's important to you. I mean, it's true.
Yeah. So then let's talk a little bit about cash flow. We've used that term a few times already. What is a cash flow?
Yep. Yeah. So very high level. There's a few different words, so like budget, spending plan. A lot of times, like these words are words people don't like to use. I think it's kind of limiting. They think, I can't, I have to figure out what I'm going to spend and then I can only stick to that. So cash flow is, I think, a better way to think about it just because it's this flow. It is fluid. Things do change. And so you have very high level, you have money coming in and you have money going out. So cash flow is the money coming in, the money going out. At the end of the day, you have to have more coming in than is going out to be able to have money left or to be able to save things like this for the future so that you will have money for later too when you have less money coming in. So at very high level, if you're a person who kind of gets stuck like in this budgeting conversation, or I don't know how much to spend, or I don't know if I'm spending right, or I think there's a lot of ways people can get stuck here. Just remind yourself at a very high level, all you're doing is making sure that what's coming in is more than what's going out or equal to, because some people will, say, hey, at the end of the day, I want to have kind of the zero sum budget to say every dollar has a place and then I'm going to put it somewhere. So even if I'm not spending it, it's going to go somewhere where I might be giving it or I might be saving it. So there's a few different ways, but at the very core of it, very simply, income minus expenses. So just to kind of help you be less overwhelmed.
Yeah. And I've said it in a past podcast, but I'm a college student and I'm in my final courses right now. And so I'm in a course called Senior Seminar. And so we're reviewing everything we've talked about. And one of the things is business finance and accounting. And we talk a lot about the cash flow statement. And the cash flow statement is so important to understanding the health of a business's finances. Because if, like you said, there's not money left over, how are you going to pay the bills tomorrow? So like the fallacy is assuming, I have all these assets, all my accounts are so high. That's great. But if you don't have money in the bank to pay the bills tomorrow, you're not going to be around for much longer. And so I think the fallacy people can fall into is, oh my gosh, I have all these assets, or oh my gosh, my bank account is still in the green. Okay, but are you really understanding the status of your finances and what do you have left over?
I think too, people just don't understand how big of an input this is. So when we do a plan for someone, and let's say that we assume you're spending, let's just say $60,000 a year outside of maybe a mortgage and things like that. So this is just everyday expenses like gas, travel, stuff like that. Could be kids, whatever. So $60,000 a year versus if we say $70,000 a year or $100,000 a year, that makes a huge difference because what we also assume is $60,000 today. Next year is $60,000 times 3% for inflation. Mm-hmm. And so it gets more expensive every year. And this is why I think this is a helpful conversation, because I think a lot of people are finding themselves probably, if you've just, let's say you haven't changed your lifestyle, you're just spending all of the same things that you normally do every year. You might be finding yourself this year saying, well, my dollar doesn't go as far. That's inflation right there. And so this is where when you build a plan and we say, how much are you spending? Now we have a place to start from. So this is why it's important. This is why you've got to figure this out, because it's such a big piece of this.
Yeah, for sure. So then, how should people start analyzing their cash flow? In my opinion, I think you need to start with what's coming in. So can you just break down for us how you help people walk through their income?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So this one is can be an easy one for people who, maybe have a W-2 job where they have a salary, so they know what they're getting every year. So you've got income just from an employer. Now you also might have things like a bonus. You also might be commission based. So some of these are the places that people get stuck because they don't know how do I figure that? How do I figure this in? How do I account for this? And so at the core of it, it's just what income do you know you have coming in? If that's fluctuating, just income coming in. So this could be from a lot of different areas. If you're retired, for example, you could have a pension, you could have Social Security, you could have, a lot of different sources of income. If you have a rental property, whatever that is, income coming in, and you basically just write all of this down, categorize it. If you're using a system, whatever that is, income coming in, that's what it is. So money you're earning, whether you're working or not, where's that money coming from? Could be gifts. So maybe you get Christmas gifts every year. Maybe you get birthday gifts. that could be part of that too. So any money coming in.
Yeah. And then this is where understanding your cash flow is so important, because what happens when you lose your job, when you go into retirement, when all of a sudden you have a disability? Like, now that's when you need to know what you earn and where it's coming from so that you can supplement it. So can you just talk a little bit about the planning behind that?
Yep. Yeah. So very commonly, here in the United States, Social Security is, income that people receive in retirement. So that can start as early as age 62 or as late as age 70. So in that range, you could start Social Security, your retirement benefits. That actually makes up a pretty decent portion for a lot of people. I think people are surprised how much they get from Social Security, but Social Security is income in retirement. Outside of that, when you're working, you have that income. So because income can be different and come from different places, this is why it's really important. So think about your income. We're going to talk about the expenses next, but what's important about this is if you know how much you're earning, then you can start to see, well, how much are my expenses dependent on this? So now when we start to talk about a job change, when we start to talk about retirement, this is why you'll have a lot of retirees, for example, that their goal is to pay off their mortgage before they retire because they don't want that expense in retirement. That can be a big expense. If that's $1,500 or $2,000 a month, now you retire. Well, if my Social Security benefits are only going to be $1,500 or $2,000 a month, that's going to take up all of that Social Security benefit. So depending on the savings that you have outside of that, that might be kind of hard to cover all those expenses. This is why you'll start to see some of these things or some of these goals that people have. Another reason too is the time that you start working. So in your career, let's just say that you start working at age 25, you get a 30-year mortgage. So just in this country, if we kind of think of some of these common things, the way things get set up for most people, let's just say you start working at age 25, you get a 30-year mortgage. So by the time, if you don't make any changes, you don't refinance, you don't do anything, and you just carry that mortgage, now by age 55 or at age 55, that mortgage is going to be paid off. So you can start to see how some of these things tie together. Like there's a reason for some of these different lengths of time. Then by the time your retired mortgage is paid off, so now that Social Security might be covering mostly expenses. But what happens in reality is that people refinance to get a lower rate. So now that 30 years gets pushed out. So this is where some of this planning comes in, because people might say, well, I don't have this mortgage paid off by that age. Or they might say, I'm going to work a little bit longer so that it is paid off. This is where some of this planning comes in to say, what's unique to you? What's custom to your situation? And so this is why, should I be paying more to get that paid off by then? These are the types of questions you start to have. So whether it's retirement, whether it's a change in income, maybe you don't like the stress of your job. Maybe you're saying, I want to scale back. Maybe you're saying, I don't want to fully retire, but I want to semi-retire and I want to be able to earn less, to have less stress, but I'm not ready to completely be done. You need to know how much income you're going to be receiving from those, because it may not necessarily be that I was earning $100,000 and now by going half time, I'm going to earn exactly half. That's $50,000. It could be that you're going to be earning less or even more. So this is where it's important to understand kind of how much is coming in based on what you're doing. So
yeah. And it's crazy to see the differences that people have. I know you mentioned like some people are W-2 and your income is pretty stable. But then there are the people who are freelancers or who are contractors, and it changes all the time. And if you don't know the baseline for how much money is coming in, how in the world are you going to be able to supplement that?
And another thing too, that's just a reminder for people. Another really big thing is we'll actually see it fairly commonly that people who are getting ready to retire want to buy a home where they're thinking they'll retire, which might be in a different state, but they aren't necessarily going to sell the home that they live in now quite yet. And so we always remind people, be sure if you're going to be getting a mortgage, using a mortgage, for that overlap time, whether it's 1 or 2 years, and then retiring and selling, your current primary residence, just be sure that you're doing that while you have income. Because just a reminder, if you need to borrow money, you've got to have income. The bank wants to know that you're going to pay that off. And so always reminding people, if you think you're going to be making these transitions, just be sure that you're actually going to have income to show on a loan application. So That's all stuff that's really important just to remember that all comes from that income piece. So it's surprising how many people, might actually be getting mortgages when they're in their 50s or 60s.
Yeah, for sure. So then there's the second half of the cash flow. Everything that's trickling in, but then where does it go? And that right there is the question of the day. So how do you begin to help people track where their money's going?
Yeah. Yeah. So like I mentioned, it's very common that people don't necessarily know. I kind of see like two groups of people. They either know and they're using a system and it's tracked and they can print you a report and they're very proud of it, which is so cool because they're putting in the time to do it. Or there's people that say, I don't know. I really don't have a clue. And I would say equally, there's probably equal numbers of people in both buckets. And so we have to have a way to get to that number. So there's very quickly, for us, we can say, well, anything that I always kind of say, like people are proud or they're excited to tell you if there's money that they're saving, if there's money that they're giving, but they usually don't want to tell you if there's money they're spending because you might judge them. You might think, well, you're spending a little bit more than you need to, or Starbucks, or whatever that is for you. And so we kind of have just like a back of the napkin, income, everything coming in. So think, if your salary, whatever, that income piece we just did, minus savings. So anything going into your 401k, minus giving, things that we know you're doing and we can track. Everything else that's left from that, we assume gets spent. That now becomes that spending number. That's just a very big, basic, broad way that you can get to. Now, the tricky thing with that is, let's say that in 2024 or 2025, you spend a lot more in that year because you had expenses come up. So this is where if you're not tracking what you're spending for, we can assume that in 26, 7, and 8, you're going to be spending that much more in those years too. But you're saying, but wait, we spent $30,000 to get our heating and air conditioning replaced. And so you can see how like one number can skew everything that you're assuming going forward. This is why it's really important to actually break these out. But outside of that, this is where we could actually say very high level, income minus giving minus saving, anything that's left over that we know isn't going somewhere, we're just going to assume that's being spent. And so that can by default become that expense number.
Yeah. And something interesting about that spending number, that leftover number, is it's going to change depending on your life stage. I know I, as a college student, have a very different spending number than like you do as someone with a family or as a retiree with an empty nest and a world of travel ahead of them.
Exactly. And I think also what's interesting is when we're assuming how much people are going to spend in the future, a lot of people will think, I'm going to spend more now, but less later. What actually happens, and this is kind of the more now when I'm retiring and maybe these first 10 years, I'm going to spend more now. What actually happens is it just changes what you're spending it on. So again, kind of back to this lifestyle, we grow accustomed to the lifestyle that we live. So if you like to go out for coffee versus make your own coffee at home, if you like to have certain furniture and when it gets old or tattered, you replace it, you're used to that. And so it's highly unlikely that you're going to change a lot of these things if you've been doing them for 30 or 40 years. But some people do. So we also assume there is kind of this basic lifestyle that you're accustomed to. So what's interesting is people will say, well, I'm going to spend less or I'm going to do more. What happens is you're just you're just spending it on different things. So for example, you might be going on more travel. You might be doing more things with your family while you're able to, but then later in life, you might be spending more on healthcare expenses. Maybe that's someone coming in to kind of help, once a day or once a week to kind of check on you. So you just spend it on different things. So this is where it doesn't necessarily change dramatically. It's just what you spend it on is what changes.
Yeah, for sure. And so as you start to look at that final piece, that spending piece, that's often where the most important information is as you're trying to make changes or adjust. So how do you help people break down and analyze what they're spending?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is one of the biggest things. So again, we said you can take what's left over and say, this is what we're spending. That's going to get you closer than not knowing anything. And I will say a lot of people are actually surprised. you might hear, oh, you're spending 60,000. A lot of people will be like, oh, that can't be that much. But when you really think about it and they start to really dig into it after that, so when we kind of say, this is the amount, can you confirm that's the amount? And we say, can you start to look through things? What people will do is they'll very generally kind of say, oh yeah, my credit card bill is normally 5,000 a month. Okay, well, 12 months, that gets you to that 60,000 pretty quickly. So people, I think, are more aware. They just don't spend the time to dig into the details. So factors for you to think about or identify in your spending are, where are you spending? How much are you spending? So wherever that is, how much is that? When are you spending that? So this is important, because think of things like property taxes. If you have this twice a year or once a year, or maybe it's a little bit every month. So when does it come up so you can budget for it? And then frequency, how many times does it happen? So again, kind of back to the once a month, once a year. So these are all really important. So you can actually build that budget so that you're setting money aside for when those expenses come up.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's also where the items like your Starbucks spending will come in, because you might not realize how often you're spending money on something like Starbucks. So looking at those factors is super important to understanding your actual spending breakdown. So that's why cash flow and understanding the income and the expenses is so important, because then you can start to adjust, pivot, and take control. And whether you call that a budget or a spending plan, or if you literally call it a cash flow, you need to come up with some kind of plan. And so there are different tools to help with that. So why don't you just walk us through some of the tools that you recommend to people as they start to look at their own personal cash flow?
Yeah, because personal cash flow is just that, it's personal. So everybody spends differently. Everybody wants to give their money to different places for different things. There are tools to track it. So some people like QuickBooks, Monarch Money, You Need a Budget, or even simply a spreadsheet that you create. Everybody, again, likes to see information in different ways. So you just might like a very simple, you enter it, because then you're going through and actually reviewing this. So that might be your way of making sure you're reviewing it. Pencil and paper. There's a lot of people that still use that, and that works perfectly fine if that works for you. These are systems that actually will take that information. So you're going to enter this information and then you can summarize it. So this is, at the end of the day, this is data, this is information that you're trying to summarize, and you're trying to be able to use then to apply it to, should I be making changes? How much am I spending? So you're kind of, getting to some of these big numbers, accumulating them to be able to use them. If you spend all of your money, I've mentioned this, 100% in cash, then it's going to be very hard for you to track where you spent money. But most people do not do that. I don't know of anybody who actually does that 100% of the time. So there's got to be a place where you can actually track where that money is going. So whether that's a credit card statement or whether it's just a bank statement, if money is coming out from an account or by using a card, then it's being tracked. So you can find this information. So this is where, if you aren't going to use a system, just find those statements and you can actually summarize that information there.
As people are thinking about those systems, what are some features or pros or cons of them?
Yeah, one of the biggest benefits is a lot of these systems. So for example, let's say that you get gas at similar places, or, we all live, kind of like in our bubbles, maybe our 10-minute, radius, whatever that is, or 30-minute radius. So we go to the same places. A lot of these systems actually, they're saying, okay, that's gas, that's this. And so a lot of this is automatically getting put into categories for you. This just saves you time. So as long as you're setting them up correctly, the biggest thing is then you can take this information. So again, we're just saying this is just data and information, and you want to summarize it. It's going to summarize it for you to say, okay, 10% of your budget is being spent on gas or transportation. 10% is on food, whatever that is. So it's actually going to start to categorize it for you. It's going to save you time. So that's one of the big pros. One of the cons is you do need to set it up. So you'll have to be sure that you're categorizing those things, or that you're going in at least once a month. If you go in once a month, then you're going to catch these things and it's going to still be top of mind. So this is where you're going to remember, oh, last week or 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. So the more frequently you do it, then you're remembering those, and you're not trying to think, well, back in January, when did I go? What did I spend, $50 on? That's going to be very hard. So the con can be having the time. But again, the pro and the benefit of this is actually being able to use that information to now say, do I like this? Do I, now I can see, okay, wow, I'm spending a lot on this. And so maybe things like recurring subscriptions, you're spending more than you want to. And when you see that amount, you might say, wow, that's $600 a year. I don't even watch that much, or I don't even listen to this that much. Now you can start to weigh what's the value I'm getting versus what I'm paying for that item. And so that's what you can start to see. And then you can cancel those if you want to. Recurring expenses. So not just subscriptions, but just recurring expenses, which you mentioned, like Starbucks or gas or whatever that is, things that you spend money on frequently. Am I okay with that amount, or do I want to make a change? So these are the things you start to see, because you see it not in the $7 a day, but you start to see in that, oh, that's $3,000 a year, $4,000 a year. That seems like a lot. Or you might say, you know what? Yes, I know I'm spending that. That's my thing that I spend on, whatever that is. That's how you can start to then think through it.
Yeah, and it's also worth mentioning that just because you're tracking it doesn't mean it's a bad thing. So you might be okay spending so much money on Starbucks because that's something you enjoy. And we always talk about living more and giving more. And if that's an example of one thing that brings you life, then go for it. Full send it. Get that daily Starbucks.
Yep.
So one thing that concerns a lot of people is they will exceed their budget often. I mean, that stat you shared at the beginning, that 84% of Americans say that they will exceed their budget, that's crazy. So when is it okay to exceed your budget, and how do you kind of curb some of that out of control spending?
Yeah, I think, one of the biggest things is this is the whole reason why you set up a budget, a spending plan. If you set a budget and you frequently find that you're going over it, then you need to review what that is. So I would say it's not okay to always say, well, every month I always spend 5% more on this and I don't spend that 5% here that I had budgeted in this category. Then you need to change your budget to allocate for the more spending there. So if this is a frequent thing, so like a budget, for example, if you're just going over budget in one category but not another, you just need to change your budget. If you're saying I'm spending more altogether, more money than I have, then you have to adjust something somewhere. You have to, like, your income has to be more than your expenses. Otherwise, you start to go down the path of having credit card debt, that piling on top of each other. And if that already is kind of spiraling out of hand, then it's going to be really hard to get out of that too. So one of the things that I think people forget is how small changes make a huge difference. So even just changing a few things, and sometimes it's even just for a little while so that you can get things back into order, so that, you've got to be able to, if you're tracking it, you've got to be able to see, okay, wait, last month was a rough month. Like we did more than we thought, or we went on vacation, spent a little bit more than we thought we would. Okay, we're going to get it back on track this month. So those are the kind of conversations you have to have. If it's just you, you've got to have those conversations with yourself. Why am I doing this? What's the source of this? If you're a couple, this is where you've got to start to talk about these things. One of the interesting things that I see, and I think it's like one of the biggest misconceptions, is I was having a conversation with a potential client last week, and the way they worded this, I loved this. They're looking for an advisor. They've been, they're good savers. They have good income. But something they said, we're not interested in externally visible wealth. So they're not interested in other people being able to see how much they make, how much they have, how big of a car they have, how nice of a car they have. That isn't what they're interested in. And actually, I would say a lot of people say this same exact thing. I just loved the way they said it. This is why you have books like The Millionaire Next Door, things like this. Not everybody, you don't have to spend everything that you earn. It's okay to have money sitting there. It is really important when you have a budget. So this is why we talk about an emergency fund. You have to have money set aside for when times like this, expenses do come up that you weren't planning for. This is when you would say, okay, I need to take money out of that to pay for this so that I can get back on track. this is where, you've got to keep your budget on track. You've got to be able to spend within what you're earning. So I just think that's really interesting. And I think a lot of people just think, well, if you have a financial advisor, you're very wealthy or you want to be. And that isn't true. It just means that you want someone to help you to make the most of the hard-earned money that you're making. And you want to be sure that as you go through different things in life, different transitions, that you're spending it wisely, that you're saving money where you can. If there's financial planning strategies you can be using, that you're saving into the right types of accounts. That's all that means. And they're just saying, I don't have the time, the interest, or the knowledge. Usually it's one of those to be able to do this myself. And I just want a partner who's going to walk through this with me. So I just loved how this person said this because I think it takes us back to this thought of budgeting. And I think that's why a lot of times it's hard because we don't want to give up the things that we like or the things, the lifestyle that we have. But we also have to live within, our lifestyle has to fit within the income that we're earning. You won't last very long if you're trying to live a lifestyle that you don't have the money for. And so that's where you have to have these hard and honest conversations. But also, I also want to encourage people at the end of the day, spending, this expense piece of it, you're spending this hard-earned money. And we always encourage people, we want, your plans to be designed for life. We want you to live more and give more. And that might mean spending money, but that's what you've earned this money for. And so whether you're giving it away to kids, charities, others, or spending it on something you want to enjoy, that also creates memories. And so we want to encourage clients to do that, not to just store it up and store more and more and more. That is not the goal at all.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why understanding your cash flow is so important. Knowing what's coming in, knowing what's going out, and whether it's being spent, whether it's being given, whether it's being saved, you can start to understand what's important to you, kind of like you said. What are you enjoying? What are you spending money on that you shouldn't be spending money on? And then where do you want to change?
Yeah, it's kind of this compounding effect. Like budgeting is a basic, but we have to review it often, and we review it in different stages of life or before different stages or before different transitions. And, I just think with inflation today, there's different businesses that are laying people off. Life can happen. So one of this basic thing, budgeting, spending plan, cash flow, understanding your personal cash flow is kind of a basic thing, but it serves you really well. And it compounds when you start to actually talk about, well, can I do the things in life that I wanted to do? At the end of the day, I want to know this because I want to know those things. And so this is where it compounds to bigger and better things so that you can actually answer these questions. And so that's how we help people. And there is a way. That's why we're saying you can figure all of this out. We can get to these numbers.
Yeah, for sure. So as we start to wrap up, do you have any closing thoughts that you want to share?
Yeah, I would just say, if you find yourself as a person who says, I don't even know what we're spending on, I would encourage you just to very simply, if you want to use a system where you can actually plug in or link your bank account, it can get you started very quickly. So any of these ones that I've listed, you can do that very quickly. I would say make the time to sit down with your spouse. If these are hard conversations, this is where I love as an advisor. Sometimes, we're kind of like a third party. We're just saying, hey, we're having a conversation together. And sometimes like jokingly, it's easier for me to say, all right, guys, all right, we start talking about like budgeting things because I know, Steve and I have these conversations, Rob, Trevor, like we all talk about these things and we're all different. We all like to spend our money on different things. And others of us can be good about saying, well, I don't spend on that, but I spend on this. And we all understand. And so that's where it's coming from, this common place of understanding. We get it. We're all trying to figure this out. And so those are the things where I just enjoy those conversations because sometimes it just kind of helps lighten it and say, okay, money is fluid and we want to be able to make changes as they come. And so, yeah, I think just helping people understand, start where you're at. And even if that's the basics or getting something linked or just having the conversation, just start where you're at.
And I think one of the most important things about understanding your cash flow is it is a regular thing. It's a basic thing. But because it's something you have to update continually, you have the opportunity to stay updated on what you're doing each month or each quarter. And that's That's where the power lies, because then you can begin to understand patterns and make changes and prevent them from becoming problems. So, to end this episode, our big statement to you is we want you to get your money in order. So schedule a couple of hours, head to your local Starbucks, buy a latte, and pull out those statements. We have a couple of resources that you can check out in our show notes. So we have a video on income for retirement and health insurance and things like that that you might find helpful as you're breaking this down for yourself. And anything else we've mentioned in this episode, we'll link in the show notes, like all of those budgeting systems. But if you find yourself overwhelmed or stressed by breaking down your cash flow, you can reach out to our team. That's what we're here for. We're here to help you and come alongside you. That way you don't need to feel stressed or worried about your finances. But that's all for today. Thank you for sticking around to the end, and we'll talk to you in the next episode. Thanks for listening. To find any links or resources related to this episode, check out our show notes. Your host was Michelle Smollenberger, a certified financial planner and CEO. The guests featured are from Financial Design Studio, a team of experienced, fiduciary, fee-only advisors based in Chicago. Anna Lewis is the executive producer of the Behind the Designs podcast. And as always, for more information about Financial Design Studio and who we are, check out our website, financialdesignstudio.com. And final note, no content discussed on this podcast should be taken as financial advice. Financial Design Studio accepts no responsibility for your individual choices. We'll see you in the next episode.